Good morning and welcome to the opening day of A Call to Transform Manila Museums Summit, hosted by the Metropolitan Museum of Manila and the National Commission for Culture and the Arts, in collaboration with the Alliance of Greater Manila Area Museums and with the support of our education partners, Museum Foundation of the Philippines and De La Salle University Publishing House. Formally open A Call to Transform Manila Museum Summit 2020, and to deliver today's welcome remarks, we would like to welcome Mr. Alejandre, Executive Director of the National Commission for Culture and the Arts.
Good morning, President Tina Colayco of the Metropolitan Museum of Manila, President Dannie Alvarez of the Alliance of Greater Manila Area Museums, Director Yuchengco of the National Gallery, Singapore, and Singapore Art Museum, Mr. Patrick Flores from Vargas Museum and Filipino Research Center, distinguished speakers and guests, artists, and cultural workers. Once again, good morning. Maayong buntag sa atong tanan. On behalf of the National Commission for Culture and the Arts, or NCCA, I would like to extend my warmest welcome to all of you to the 2020 Metro Manila Museums Summit, hosted by the Metropolitan Museum of Manila in collaboration with the Alliance of Greater Metro Manila Museum, or AGMA. In a 2015 article titled Making Museums, the Development of Philippine Museums from 1901 to 1998, Eric Zerudo, former Executive Director of Philippine Association of Museum Incorporated, or PAMI, wrote, the development of Philippine museums in the past 98 years have been from tradition to innovation. In the early stage, museums conform to the orthodox framework as institutions that collect and exhibit materials, culture for the education of humanity. In the recent years, museums have become cultural animators and social reformers. True museums and galleries have always been regarded as repositories of our collective history and knowledge, tasked with making sure that our cultural heritage reaches a broad swath of the public and that all visitors, regardless of race, ethnicity, gender, or age, or language, feel welcome. But as Zerudos expound, museums are not only places of static, immovable collection, but of dynamic and engaging pieces that provides critic and stimulate fruitful discussion of social issues. And much like the Philippines, museum around the world have always taken the same route. Nevertheless, I believe we can all agree that the present challenges goes beyond what a museum should be, but how the museum and the community built around them should continue amidst COVID-19. I believe today's summit echoes it perfectly, just as the change of function is regarded. A call to transform underscores the need to adopt during this precarious time, utilizing the digital offerings of the modern world and reorienting our programs that responds to the needs of our community. Leaping into 2020, museums around the world are now witnessing some of the lowest turnout of visitors. In fact, latest UNESCO report reveals that 90% of them closed their doors and more than 10% may never reopen. As the theme of the summit suggests, museum needs to address this uh, social their challenges while together while facing a whole series of challenges in their own social, political, and economic context. Individual museums have no choice but to keep re-evaluating and redefining their roles, their hardware, software, and programs. As a de facto Ministry of Culture in the Philippines, the NCCA, along with its partners, continues to spearhead various major programs as we celebrate the Museum and Galleries Month this October. Raising the pandemic, programs were shifted online. This includes MGM Canaba, a free webinar series aimed at educating and increasing the interest of the general public on museums and other cultural institutions. The second is the Mindanao Art Fair exhibit and conferences organized by Lawig Diwa Incorporated. And today's summit, which served as a convergence of expertise and dialogue among museum and cultural leaders across the globe. Whilst museums have long been recognized as repositories of knowledge and the vanguard of cultural heritage, how can we further transform and maintain museums as cultural institutions that truly inspire and educate, enrich lives, and create healthy communities during this time of uncertainty? How can we make museum visit and tour done online a pleasant and memorable experience? How best can we maintain the future viability, relevance, and sustainability of museum now that we can confronted by unseen enemy? These are some of the key questions that are best answered by experts like you. Throughout the summit, together we can share insights, identify the best practices, and forge closer collaboration and hopefully transform our ideas into action for the benefit of not only art and culture sector, but the entirety of our nation. At this point, I'd like to thank Metropolitan Museum of Manila, headed by Ma'am Tina Colayco, and the Alliance of Greater Manila Area Museum under the leadership of Mr. Dannie Alvarez for being our fervent partners in arousing national consciousness and pride in our rich Filipino culture and heritage, embodying the inspiration of the nation expressed in all media of art as well as historical and religious artifacts. And all of this will not be easy, but we must persevere for our people. As Zerodas wrote, remind us museums will continue to exist and evolve as long as they provide meaning to people and uplift their life. Once again, thank you very much. Maraming salamat at mabuhay po tayong lahat. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Alejandre, for those inspiring words from the NCCA. This summit was closely coordinated with the Alliance of Greater Manila Area Museums, or AGMA. Here with us today to deliver a message for museum participants of this summit is Mr. Dannie Alvarez, President of AGMAM and the Administrator of the Yuchengco Museum.
To our NCCA Executive Director, Ryan Alejandre, our keynote speakers, Eugene Tan of the National Gallery of Singapore, Patrick Flores of the Vargas Museum, and Tina Colayco of the Metropolitan Museum, and to all the attendees of today's webinar, pleasant greetings. The Alliance of Greater Manila Museums, or AGMAM, is honored to be a part of this important dialogue among museums and museum professionals, particularly participated in by representatives from some noted museums in Asia, America, and Europe. AGMAM is the accredited regional cluster of for the capital region of the Philippines by the Committee of Museums, or NCOM, of the National Commission for Culture and the Arts, or the NCCA. It has continuously encouraged memberships by institutions and individual museum workers from the growing number of museums in the Greater Manila region. The organizer of this timely webinar, the Metropolitan Museum of Manila, being one of the pioneer members of AGMAM, has for this year's annual summit organized this webinar not only for AGMA members, it has so generously expanded its availability to some museums outside our region. AGMAM was established in 2013 when the NCCA expanded the constitution of the National Committee of Museums under its subcommission on cultural heritage to include the representation of museums in the capital region in the roster of the original 10 regional museum associations nationwide. Last year, the regional representation in NCOM was further increased to accommodate 2 more regional clusters in Mindanao. Initially, AGMAM implemented a series of roundtable discussions on museum education and organizing its first regional summit in 2015. Most recently, AGMAM has twice over been tasked by NCCA to organizing the biennial Museum National Summit by Lopez Museum of the 2017 Plotting Points 1, followed by the 2019 Plotting Points 2 organized by Yuchengco Museum. For 2020, at the onset of pandemic, AGMAM organized a series of museum online talks to tighten its network in order for museums to access all our members so we can together assess the impact of this worldwide health issue on our local museums. One of the major thrusts of AGMAM is capability building and continuing the professionalization amongst its members. The global issue of the pandemic became a serious platform for AGMAM to evolve its programming so it may address the many issues being all of us are affected in our local museum scene. While the problem persists, the virtual world provided the route via online for a closer collaboration we rarely did before. We created opportunities to reformat while reinforcing our belief in the value of the cultural platform in protecting and preserving our collective heritage. These continuing dialogues amongst us have proven successful with the diverse participation of our speakers and panelists who are in the field either of art or creative industries in all the 4 days of this webinar. Our challenge to develop this format will continue when, in 2021, we plan to engage our colleagues in the wide field of history and history museums. Finally, we would like to thank the National Commission for Culture and the Arts for the availability of a grant in order for us to call an annual museum summit, to the Metropolitan Museum of Manila for organizing this awesome array of speakers and panelists, to the Museum Foundation of the Philippines for this wonderful opportunity for us to create a collective resolve in creating a new normal for museums here and the world over. Again, stay tuned for the next 4 days as we exchange ideas amongst ourselves. Thank you very much at maraming salamat po.
Thank you, Mr. Alvarez, and to the members of the AGMAM board for your support for the Manila Museums Summit 2020. And now to provide us with an overview of the summit's proceedings and to introduce our first keynote speaker, we would like to welcome Ms. Tina Colayco, President of the Metropolitan Museum of Manila.
Good morning and welcome to one and all. This being the first day of the summit, allow me to thank all of you for joining us. This is a summit presented by the Metropolitan Museum of Manila and the National Commission for Culture and the Arts in partnership with AGMAM, the Museum Foundation of the Philippines, and the De La Salle University Publishing House. I hope that you have all had the chance to go over the summit program, which will run for 4 successive half days starting today. The summit envisions to cultivate a critical understanding on possible directions and solutions that museums are moving towards and the strategies implemented by the different institutions in adapting to these precarious times. Each summit session promises to be as exciting as the next with its goals, its amazing speakers who will provide us with food for a lot of thought and stimulating discussions thereafter. Our first keynote speaker for the day is known to many of us for welcoming us to the National Gallery of Singapore. Dr. Eugene Tan is the director of NGS and takes the lead on key museological and curatorial aspects of the gallery's work. He is key to influencing the intellectual framework that guides the display and development of the gallery's collection. In his capacity as director, he guides the institution towards the vision of becoming a leading museum of contemporary art. Dr. Tan also published and curated widely for exhibitions such as the Singapore Pavilion at the 51st Venice Biennale in 2005, the inaugural Beyond Singapore Biennale in 2006, and Reframing Modernism, Paintings from Southeast Asia, Europe, and Beyond in 2016. He currently serves as a board member of the International Committee for Museums and Collections of Modern Art, or CMAM, and the Museum of Contemporary Art, Antwerp. Ladies and gentlemen, we are very honored to have Dr. Tan with us, and let us welcome him with his presentation on art museums and social change.
Thank you very much, Tina. Well, good morning, everyone, and greetings from Singapore. Well, firstly, I'd like to thank Tina Colayco and the Metropolitan Museum of Manila, Mr. Alejandre, and the NCCA, as well as Mr. Dannie Alvarez and the Alliance of Greater Metro Manila Museums for inviting me to speak at this conference. Well, the COVID-19 pandemic has disrupted and affected every facet of our lives, not to mention the tragedy and suffering it has caused to millions globally. It has also profoundly impacted many museums around the world, with the lockdown and closures making museums review their operational models. But beyond this, the social crises that have been brought to light by the pandemic have also prompted museums to reevaluate their roles and their missions when it comes to advocating for social justice issues. What is the role of the art museum in addressing our present-day social and political urgencies? Can art museums be a generator of social change? Before I get to that topic, please allow me to begin by giving a brief introduction to the two institutions in Singapore that I oversee, the National Gallery Singapore and the Singapore Art Museum. The National Gallery Singapore, which opened in November 2015, was converted from two national monuments, the former Supreme Court and the City Hall, both of which were constructed in the 1920s and 1930s. The gallery has two permanent exhibitions, one that tells the story of Singapore art and the other about Southeast Asia art. Through these two exhibitions, the gallery aims to examine the shared historical impulses in the region, highlighting the complexities and relationships between national and regional art histories. This purpose is further complemented by gallery projects that contextualize local and regional developments within a wider global context. The exhibition in the Singapore Gallery is titled Siapa Nama Kamu, which is Malay for What is Your Name? The exhibition aims to actively call an analysis of how art and identity operate through inclusions and exclusions, representation and de-representation, and the accumulation of art historical memory in museums. As the titular question operates within this exhibition, it intimates what is shown, how it is shown, but also maybe what is not shown. Siapa nama kamu is then a question and an invitation. Siapa nama kamu, together with another question, where do you come from, are found in a painting by Chua Mia Tee that you see here, entitled National Language Class. Chua was part of a generation of young artists who were actively involved in the independence struggles of the 1950s. In 1959, the year when the painting was completed, Singapore had gained self-government. Malay would be declared as a national language to unite the different ethnic groups in Singapore through a common Malayan identity. In the painting, a group of Chinese students are seated behind a table, learning the national language from a Malay teacher. Behind him hangs a blackboard on which the two basic questions about identity and belonging were written. Like the painting's title, the entire exhibition is a query. It's a prompt to discuss art and Singapore and the parameters of personal and national identity in art. How has our art and our history changed? Who are our artists? And where do we even begin? Well, the Singapore Gallery looks at the emergence of the modern art in the 19th century when Singapore came under British colonial rule and its development through the 20th century until the present day. Our other long-term exhibition is the Southeast Asia Gallery, which aims to provide a regional narrative of modern art in Southeast Asia from the 19th century to the present, highlighting the richness and diversity through shared historical experiences, as well as the key impulses to art making across the region. This is the first time there's a long-term and comprehensive exhibition devoted to the historical development of art in Southeast Asia from a regional perspective. The current understanding of Southeast Asia is often framed through the economic political configuration of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, an approach that has limitations. Therefore, it is also the aim of our Southeast Asia Gallery to complicate an understanding of our region in particular and our regionality more generally, to address how we understand Southeast Asia as a geopolitical entity, but also an imaginary, by looking at the world, by looking at the art that we have produced. So you see here one of our first galleries in the Southeast Asia Gallery, the work by Simon Flores on the left. And this gallery shows the artists from the 19th century. This gallery shows artists working in the 1960s, and you see here Jose Hoya's work, Fernando Zobel, as well as Navarro's sculpture right in the center. Apart from the gallery's two permanent exhibitions, we also have special exhibitions which result from new research and further examine in more detail aspects of our art histories that the overview in the permanent exhibitions cannot delve into. Our special exhibitions aim to examine the links and relationships between the art of Southeast Asia and other parts of the world, recontextualizing not only Southeast Asia into larger art historical narratives, but rethinking all the art historical narratives through the perspectives of Southeast Asia. One such exhibition was Reframing Modernism, which attempted to explore new ways of looking at the history of modernism through art, through an encounter between the collections of the Centre Pompidou and our National Gallery. The exhibition did not follow a chronological narrative or a story of stylistic progression. Our goal was to unsettle the assumptions about the history of modernism by comparing artists from the regions of Southeast Asia and Europe. The exhibition's layout reflected our attempt to offer different and multiple entry points into modernism, to unpack the problematics of influence, hierarchy, and linearity. The whole exhibition was built up by connecting one artist's body of work to another in a network-like structure based on shared or intersecting approaches to modernism, ways of working, and conceptual orientation. Here you see some works from the exhibition. We've also done exhibitions of artists working in the 19th century, such as Between Worlds, Raden Saleh and Wan Luna, which examine two of the most significant 19th century artists in the region and their relationships to Europe and Asia. Here you see the section on Raden Saleh, and here from Wan Luna. On the left are two versions of his España de Filipinas out of the 7 that he made. And on the right, The Death of Cleopatra from like 1881, which he won the silver medal at the Madrid Exposition. Perhaps one of the most important shows that we've done since we've opened is Awakenings, Art and Society in Asia from 1960s to 1990s, which explore the complex relationships between art and society to understand how artists engaging with experimental art forms acted as catalysts for transformation and change in society during one of the most turbulent periods in Asia. The period between the 1960s and 1990s was characterized by ideological confrontations, a rise in nationalism, rapid modernization, and a wave of democratic movements across Asia. The multitude of experimental art practices that emerged in Asia during that time reflected how artists and the wider public were awakened to the emancipatory power of art to shape and assert their identities. Artists at the time questioned conventions and challenged those around them to assume new positions of criticality in society. They questioned invisible but dominant structures of power in society and sought through their work to express the struggles felt by the marginalized, the rapid rise of urbanization and consumer capitalism. Art was relocated into everyday reality and public space to communicate these common ideas to the people. This strong determination to effect change led to redefined boundaries for art in Asia. Artists began to experiment with new technologies and materials to capture local stories, including using their own bodies in performance art, photography, and video, and incorporating everyday objects into installations. At the same time, new artistic collectives formed around the region, using art as a means of socio-cultural communication and developing localized responses to some of these shared issues. In Japan and South Korea, the Zero Jigen and Minjun artists intervened into the daily routines of the city, respectively staging naked performances in urban spaces and using art as agitation in the struggle for democracy. The Artist Village in Singapore advocated for socially engaged art, while Kasibulan here in the Philippines were trailblazers in raising awareness of issues such as gender relations and women's liberation through their works. Students also expressed themselves through art, including activists in Thailand's United Artists Front, who oppose art produced for the capitalist interests of those in power. We see many of these recurring in our societies today. So this exhibition was a collaboration also with the Museum of Modern Art in Tokyo and the Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art in Korea. And here are some images from the exhibitions. The other museum that I oversee, the Singapore Art Museum, on the other hand, was the first dedicated art museum in Singapore, having opened in 1996. It is home to one of the most significant collections of Southeast Asian contemporary art. It's housed in two buildings, both former schools, one a 165-year-old national monument and the other a 70-year-old conservation building. Our buildings are currently undergoing a major redevelopment that will modernize as well as increase the size of our exhibition spaces. SAM aims to contribute to the global conversation of how art of the present affects our understanding of art, but from a Southeast Asian perspective. Some of the things we've been doing since we've closed for renovation is the Singapore Biennale, which SAM organizes. The Biennale presents and reflects artistic practices in Singapore and the region within a global context and fosters collaboration and deep engagement with artists and art organizations from the region. Well, the 2019 edition was curated by none other than Patrick Flores. It had as its title, Every Step in the Right Direction. The exhibition invited the ethical gesture from both artists and public through the creative mediation of the artworks and projects, gathered from selectively selected geographies, to encourage the audience to reflect on right actions to take and decide on which activities to engage in as an effort to offer possibilities for a more humane world. Recently, we've also been working with other institutions around the region on exhibitions, and this is an exhibition with the Ilham Gallery in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, where we presented a show of Malaysian artists who explored the socio-political body of contemporary society alongside the individual subjective body. The work you see here is by the Malaysian artist Wong Hoi Chong, called Tapestry of Justice, which was developed during the Reformasi movement in the 1990s. It started both as an artwork as well as a petition against Malaysia's Internal Security Act, which allows police to arrest dissidents without any trial. The work consists of photocopies of thousands of thumbprints connected by leaves and petals of plants such as Malaysia's national flower, the hibiscus, rose, and beech. The thumbprints were sought by Yuchengco from his friends, as well as strangers, as a support for the repeal of the Internal Security Act. Another show we worked on was with the National Museum of Art in Osaka to present a show at Tycoon Contemporary in Hong Kong titled They Do Not Understand Each Other. Well, the exhibition was really about the negotiations and expectations of culture, where the premise of culture is representation, and the promise of cultural exchange, as one might reasonably suppose, is understanding. However, in light of the civil unrest and clashes in Hong Kong, which began over the extradition law, the exhibition, particularly its title, took on a different meaning during this time. And apart from this project, from next year, SAM will also be operating from temporary spaces across the city, so do watch out for this space. So moving on to the pandemic. The COVID-19 pandemic and the lockdowns around the world has changed the ways many museums have been used to operating. And this has brought the value of art and museums to the fore. Within the art world, we have seen art fairs and biennales being cancelled or moving online, removing the platforms for artists to present their works, and consequently leaving many without income. For museums and the non-profit sector, the dearth of visitorship and revenue has led to reports of some museums having to close permanently. The situation has highlighted the reliance on the networks of power and influence that underlie on neoliberal societies and the effect that this has on the operating logic of our museums. We can see this through the constant pressure that museums have to grow our visitor numbers and revenue through blockbuster exhibitions and ever popular programs. This has highlighted how the value of art and of museums are perceived in our societies. So in June, still at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic in Singapore, the main newspaper in Singapore, the Straits Times, published the results of a survey, which revealed, amongst other things, that the role of the artist was perceived as being the most non-essential in Singapore. As you can imagine, the arts community was up in arms after the publication of the survey results, leading to many angry responses and memes. My particular favorite meme was this take on the National Gallery's logo that you see on the left here by a young design collective, which transformed our National Gallery into a non-essential gallery of Singapore. Many cultural commentators weighed in, correcting the misperception of the value that art and artists have amongst the public in Singapore. Apart from pointing out the obvious that much of how we have engaged with the world throughout the lockdowns, through online performances and digital offerings, are the result of artistic labor. In the wider sense of the word, the capacity for art to heal during times of crisis was also highlighted, as we have seen through many artistic projects initiated during the pandemic. However, more importantly, the survey results revealed how artistic labor is perceived, not only in Singapore and other parts of Asia, but also globally, through production, commodification, and spectacle, underpinned by the neoliberal societies in which we operate in, and reinforced by how the art world is structured. This system has become exposed during the current crisis, where we have seen cultural institutions shuttered, exhibitions and art fairs cancelled, affecting the livelihood of artists and other cultural workers. This question of how artistic labor is valued is at the crux of how we can support not just artists, but also the wider ecology in which they work. Is the value of art and artistic labor necessarily measured only by certain types of outputs that we are currently familiar with, framed very much by the context of our neoliberal societies? Can we move beyond familiar outputs such as the performance or the exhibition, live or in a digital form? How can we rethink artistic labor? Do we require different methodologies, language, vocabulary, and frameworks to better understand the value of artistic labor? But until we figure out the answers to these questions, we still have to work within the systems to support the artists and cultural workers during this time. So the Singapore Art Museum and the National Gallery came together with 10 other cultural institutions, independent and collectives, to support artists and cultural workers. We invited independent curators to work with 10 or more artists to create exhibitions and other projects, both physical as well as online. Co-developed by the National Gallery of Singapore and Singapore Art Museum, proposals for novel ways of being is a range of exhibitions and programs variously organized by 12 institutions, independent art spaces, and collectives, featuring more than 170 artists and cultural workers and practitioners. Each curatorial and artistic project is a proposal that broadly responds to the pandemic and intimates how art can help us understand and come to terms with the crisis we're now experiencing and the actions we can take at individual, national, and global levels. Novel Ways demonstrates a belief in the essentialness of art and artists and their role in reflecting the conditions and anxieties of our time. Art can help us understand the conditions leading to the pandemic and to recognize it as a cataclysmic event imbricated with the larger ecological crisis of climate change and planetary degradation. It can help us confront our capability as individuals implicated in an industry and in a world order underpinned by inequality, consumption, and endless growth. In creating platforms for artists to respond to the pandemic and Singapore's circuit breaker, Novel Ways is also an act of solidarity that seeks to support and provide stimulus to the art community. As a city-state entirely embedded in a global economy, characterized by virtually untrammeled flow of people, resources, and capital, the impact of COVID-19 on Singapore is decidedly seismic. The local art ecology in particular saw widespread cancellations and postponements to exhibitions and programs. And as jobs and engagements dried up, artists and independent cultural workers, perhaps the most precarious members of the community even before the crisis, have been greatly affected. Despite the pervading sense of isolation and gloom caused by the disruption, lockdown, and uncertainty regarding the state of the world, there's still an unmistakable current of hope and collegiality. It is for this reason that the title Novel Ways deliberately references the previous official name of the virus, the 2019 novel coronavirus, as we submit to waves of infection, recovery, and ever-evolving adjustments. Art can not only help us to grapple with the national and global trauma that is COVID-19, it reminds us that this is, after all, not the first pandemic or crisis that the world has encountered. There will surely be other viruses and crises. It can remind us that if we do not want to go back to the way things were, we must now begin to imagine, chart, and reach for new ways of being. So these are two exhibitions currently on show at the National Gallery now, both organized by the Singapore Art Museum and National Gallery as part of this initiative. How then do museums and art museums respond to times of crisis, such as now, such as what we are facing now? It points to the larger question of what is the role of art museum in addressing our present day social and political urgencies. Last year, ICOM, which is the International Committee of Museums, at the General Assembly in Kyoto, proposed, not without controversy, a new definition for museums, moving away from the current definition, which focuses on the museum's roles in acquiring, conserving, preserving art and in education, towards a much more expanded role of museums as inclusive, polyphonic spaces for critical dialogue, addressing conflicts and challenges of the present, and also to contribute towards upholding human dignity and social justice, global equality, and planetary well-being. As you can imagine, this was a controversial proposition, so much so that the backlash resulted in the resignation of the ICOM president, Sue Exoy, and two other board members. The museum world, it seems, is still deeply divided on this issue. But why should museums advocate for social justice? As cultural institutions, museums are an integral part of our societies. We are shaped by their broader culture and in turn reflect these back to our publics. We also have the ability to contribute and drive change. But to do so, we must start rethinking the way our museums function, the values we advocate, the systems and structures that underpin the way we currently operate, as well as our programs, amongst other things. The political theorist Chantal Mouffe argues that art museums can become sites for political intervention. But to do so will require fundamental changes to the structures of museums, given the manifold economic and political forces that currently makes the existence of museums possible. She argues that museums have to acknowledge the neoliberal structures in which museums operate, based on consumerism, and where culture is commodified, and where the notion of the blockbuster exhibition has become the modus operandi. Instead, museums need to resist the promotion of spectacle and the depoliticization of art and culture, and to come up with new ways of operating in order to become public spaces for the agonistic forms of participation in our societies. In August this year, the Singapore artist Hee Man Chong unveiled a project on the hoardings that surrounds the Singapore Art Museum while we undergo our renovation. It is an ambiguous, dynamic, and unfathomable landscape created from one of the many representations of the digital data that surrounds us and permeates our lives. It's titled Safe Entry. It was presented along the hoarding, as you see here on Bras Basah Road. It's a mural produced by repeating a single and large QR code. So the QR code has become ubiquitous in Singapore as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. As part of the contact tracing strategy, entry to all spaces, indoor and outdoor, require the public to scan a QR code in order to track their movement. And this is something we've seen around the world with governments promoting the adoption of contact tracing apps, making them mandatory in some cases. The original QR code used in Hee Man Chong's mural links to a video of the artist on a long walk to Changi Airport's Terminal 2 during Singapore's COVID-19 lockdown. Terminal 2, which is currently being renovated, parallels the ongoing refresh of SAM behind the hoarding, and members of the public are invited to take a virtual walk through the airport with the artist by scanning the original QR code, featured alongside the artwork caption on the hoarding. Chong's work addresses the insidious and authoritative regulations that governments have put in place to contain the spread of COVID-19. The mural is born out of anxieties of being watched and of data being used without permission. Chong has transformed the QR code into something monstrous and sinister, or as he puts it, an abstract cloud of unsettled fears of being exploited over and over again. While these fears being expressed by Chong are exacerbated by a new mandatory contact tracing that will soon be implemented in Singapore, called Trace Together. All residents of Singapore will soon have to carry a physical token or activate an app on their smartphone, which will trace the user's location in real time. You will no longer only be tracked when you enter a public building, the location will be tracked constantly. This is being done, as the authorities claim, in the name of public health and safety, where in the event you come into contact with someone with the virus, you can be traced and treated. Back in February, before the seriousness of the pandemic became evident, the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben warned about the danger of governments using biosecurity as a pretext for withdrawing the rights and privacy from citizens. How public health justifications are being used for political reasons, as well as an excuse to collect personal data. While Agamben's views have become controversial as the pandemic has grown in seriousness and devastation than initially thought, the danger that he warns about nevertheless, but how these measures will become accepted even after the dangers of the pandemic passes and becomes a norm, is becoming a reality. In many countries in Asia, we see governments using this as an excuse to stem protests and demonstrations, even putting off elections. In Thailand, it has been used, rather unsuccessfully as we see here, to quell the growing protests against the government. The thousands of citizens are risking their lives and liberty to stand up for their democratic rights. In Hong Kong, not only were social distancing measures used to stem protests against the national security law, but also to delay the city's legislative elections. Further distrust emerged when the government announced its aim to test everyone in Hong Kong for the virus, with fears that their DNA will be collected by the Chinese authorities, after accounts of DNA collection by the Chinese security apparatus in the Xinjiang province. Just last night, I was in a talk with the post-colonial theorist, Homi Bhabha, who spoke about the notion of the unprepared in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic and also the crises that many societies are currently experiencing. He uses the term unprepared to firstly speak about the contingent circumstances in which people find themselves at a loss for action and agency, how we are unprepared for an event or eventualities because our destiny is simply out of our hands. But the second way he uses the term is to explain how governments resort to using their unpreparedness to explain away their culpability and responsibility when faced with the consequences of misgovernance or miscalculation, and to use this as an excuse to exercise discriminatory laws, punitive regulations, censorship, and suppression of human rights, leading to the worst excesses of social polarization and ethnic tensions amongst those who are the least empowered and entitled in our societies. However, Bhabha also argues that being unprepared also prepares us for being an effective agent by first taking us aback, but then giving us the opportunity to recover and right ourselves, and hence to stand up against the illegitimate uses of power and abuses of authority. He's proposing that this moment of unpreparedness also has the potential to provide agency. And this is where art museums have a key role to play in the social reimagining of our futures. We need to become spaces for the emergence of both critical discourses and practices, in which new forms of hybrid and constituent education allow for the co-production of difference, encounter, and dissent, where relationships between aesthetic, politics, and knowledge are continually problematized and redefined. In this unprecedented time, we as cultural institutions need to reflect on our purpose and to ensure that we live up to this moment of reckoning. Thank you. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Tan, for your presentation. We appreciate the Southeast Asian perspective of the changing ecology of our environment and the varied responses that try to understand our fears, but still raise hope for challenged museums and affected members of our community. Our next keynote speaker today will be situating museums in Flux from a Philippine perspective. Dr. Patrick Flores is a professor at the Department of Art Studies, which he chaired for many years at the University of the Philippines. He currently holds the position of curator of the UP Vargas Museum in Manila. He is also the director of the Philippine Contemporary Art Network. Among the many exhibitions that Dr. Patrick Flores has curated in various art capitals around the world are Under Construction, New Dimensions in Asian Art in 2000, the Guangzhou Biennale Position Papers in 2008, the Philippine Pavilion at the Venice Biennale in 2015. He was the artistic director of the Singapore Biennale in 2019 and has been appointed the curator of the Taiwan Pavilion for the Venice Biennale in 2022. He was guest scholar of the Getty Research Institute in Los Angeles in 2014. He also has numerous publications such as The Painting History, Revisions in Philippine Colonial Art, published in 1999, Remarkable Collection, Art, History, and National Museum, 2006, and Past Peripheral Curation in Southeast Asia in 2008. Ladies and gentlemen, let us welcome Dr. Patrick Flores with his presentation on the Manila Response, Investigating Fragilities, Repositioning Imaginations.
Thank you. Thank you, Tina, for the introduction, and congratulations to you and the other organizers for this important event. The call to transform needs an investigation first into the context of institutions in the Philippines, particularly in Manila, and the nature of their engagements with the public. This talk scans the landscape through the various responses to the global public health crisis. It will focus on the main aspects of institutional work, the administrative, managerial, the curatorial, and the pedagogical. In pandemic time, these areas have yielded calibrations and improvisations, even as they have exposed fragilities. From this critical reflection of responses come possibilities of reconstruction within cultural formations and the agents who embody or exceed them. These demand reskilling curatorial work, activating the institutional imagination, and harnessing the reciprocity of the public. I work in a university museum, the Vargas Museum. So my thoughts today are for the most part shaped by this context. It is a unique context in which the museum, which is the National University, is situated within a community of intellectuals, and that its immediate constituency consists of students, scholars, professors, researchers, support personnel, and the residents in the campus. The University Museum, therefore, speaks to the demands of discourse at different levels, at various levels, and in different registers, as sharpened by the disciplines over the years. This ecology is collegial, governed by exchange between peers, and it is also activist and militant, as attested to by its history of struggles for human liberties and social justice over time. On the one hand, this context is specialized or specialist, owing to the scholarship. But on the other hand, it is generously general, the university being an intersection of subjectivities, ethnicities, and social origins across the archipelago. It is often mentioned that the university is a social microcosm. And I think this condition may well correlate in the same vein with the nature of the museum as a potential public sphere that opens up to conversations across diverse audiences, independent of, but at the same time, predisposed through specialization. That the Vargas Museum is, which is also a Filipiniana Research Center, is an interdisciplinary museum of art, history, philately, and numismatics, further thickens the texture of the institution. Indeed, the University Museum is strongly placed to mediate equivalent interests, a capacity that should inspire any type of museum. I remember how the curator and critic Clementine Delis suggested to me that perhaps it is productive to flip the category of the University Museum, which is a typology of an institution, to the Museum University, which is a sensibility and a praxis in which the commitments of the museum are redistributed across its plural sympathies in the best tradition of both the time-honored liberal arts and the digital humanities of our day. When the Philippines went on lockdown in the middle of March, the museums in Manila were caught off guard. The suddenness did not allow for contingencies to be put in place. And so this would be largely laid out incrementally across the long quarantine period, which is in effect as we speak, albeit in a less stringent form. The situation raised the issue of preparedness or readiness, and this was mentioned earlier by Eugene. How prepared or ready should the institutions have been? And what might have been the criteria of quick response? There are no easy answers to these questions because the pandemic was an unprecedented phenomenon. That being said, Chung Dai-vo, a researcher of the Asia Art Archives, makes a great point about this crisis being unprecedented and at the same time ever present, and that the pandemic has made visible the entrenched inequalities of social life and the seemingly ruthless desecration of the earth, which had led to this crisis in the first place, and may well make it permanent or cyclical if we do not do something drastic about it. In this light, the resistance of the condition of the possibility of crisis should be in the same vein as unrelenting. There are around 89 museums in Metro Manila, And this is a preliminary survey of the institutions. And they can be classified in many ways in terms of their institutional structure, whether state-supported or privately funded, of their specializations by way of their holdings and perceived public, and the orientation of their programs. Metro Manila is a sprawling territory, all of around 620 square kilometers, encompassing 16 cities and with a population of around 24 million, according to one survey. It is the fifth most populous urban area and 18th largest metropolis in the world. The Asian Development Bank considers Manila the most congested city in the developing economies of Asia in a study of 278 cities. An independent survey conducted from April 20 to May 8 this year in the context of the 8 weeks of enhanced community quarantine in Metro Manila by Janine Cabato, Beverly Tan, and Yuriko Tsumura gives us a glimpse of how the institutions in Manila had coped, confronted, and calibrated. 19 museums responded to this survey, and here are some of the findings. This is clearly just indicative of the impulses of the responses, largely focused on being present while being closed, on surviving while being severed from revenue sources like school field trips and the staff who could barely leave their residence and were struggling themselves with emotional and economic well-being, and trying to transition to a more transmedia environment. So I just give you a snapshot of some of the findings of this survey, which is, I think, important to build on. So these were the respondents. There are 19 of them responded. And then, so you have the slide on the estimated breakdown of museums revenues before the enhanced community quarantine. I cannot go into this in detail, but this is just to show you some symptoms of the problem. Opinion on economic impact of the COVID-19 outbreak on the museums. The platforms that the institutions utilize for online presence. Of course, the usual suspects of Facebook and all the way to TikTok. And the question of, do you have dedicated staff to oversee digital activities? And if what online services does your museum provide? So these are some of the responses. And what topics and digital learning resource would you want your staff to be trained for? So this is, I think, moving forward, trying to transition to a more transmedia environment. And which online platforms have you had noticeable increase in traffic? And yeah, so in the face of these turns of events, as we have gathered from the recent conversation organized by the Japan Foundation Manila, the Philippine Contemporary Art Network, and the Vargas Museum, fundamental questions have to be asked. What does it mean to be live or online? What is information? What is data in the digital world? And how is it produced and conveyed to us? These are critical considerations in light of what Mariles Gustillo of Ayala Museum calls an overstimulated audience, decisively immersed in varying degrees in the welter of the internet, and at the same time prone to digital fatigue and exasperation. In June this year, a town hall was organized by the Alliance of Greater Manila Area Museums, or AGMAM, to discuss the problems affecting the institutions. Among the points raised were the following: the contingency of the skeleton force to maintain the museums and the bare minimum of measures that could be implemented. Second, the operational costs vis-a-vis the absence of income. 3, the resolve and the resourcefulness of the staff to maintain museum life in some way, shape, or form. And 4, the critique of the government definition of what is essential and not essential, the museum falling under the latter, which I think echoes the sentiments of Eugene earlier in Singapore. And finally, 5, the feasibility of online marketing and interinstitutional collaboration. Surely the question of sufficiency stays with us. And so we ask, are we doing enough? And its underside, what else can we do? An instructive exercise might be to assess the commonplace in Philippine museums so that we can reflect on possibilities in the face of a radical incident or a protracted emergency like the one we are currently experiencing. It can be noticed, and I think many would agree with me, that the commonplace are exhibition making and the custodianship of the collection. And herein lay the problems. The exhibition and the physical care of the collections were the first to be compromised during the pandemic. Administratively and managerially, these aspects of museum work ran into serious problems, particularly for museums with workers who could not access the facility, even for basic conservation. Curatorially, the spaces for exhibition were closed, and so very few exhibitions could be installed. And those that were able to open could only receive the public virtually by appointment. So this is the usual public in the museum. The default transmission was through the internet, through virtual tours, webinars, talks, conversations, and other forms of digital delivery of online content. This online content should not be seen as a substitute of actual museum content. It is a supplement in the sense that it addresses a lack. Moreover, it is a different mode of experiencing museological material altogether that demands its own language, its own algorithm, and its own sustainability as a resource, which can eventually evolve into a library and archive open for browsing and constant revisits, as well as meeting the demands of the curricula of the educational system and its distance learning strategies, and of parents who have to practically homeschool what I would imagine already bored, restless, dispirited, or agitated children and young adults. The virtual tours also enable the museums to linger on the works in the museum more closely, bringing to the attention of the audience details and aspects that may be lost during the physical encounter. So some of the initiatives from Manila Museums, to include the initiatives of the Ayala Museum, the soon to be opened Museo ng Kaalamang Katutubo, which is an ethnographic museum, the Likhaan in the Intramuros, and the Metropolitan Museum of Manila. As I see it, the weakest aspect of museum work in Manila and the Philippines on the whole is public engagement through the typical museum education initiatives or the more innovative forms of interface, which are few and remain underdeveloped. The default mode to deal with the inaccessibility of the museum in pandemic time was to migrate to social media and let the technology create conditions of interface between a quarantined public and a remote museum. The issues here are of course obvious. First, the museums might not have had the capacity to easily migrate to social media platforms and therefore could not optimize the potentials of the media. This inability could be attributed to inadequate technological infrastructure and expertise in developing materials for the social media and facilitating engagement. Second, the museums might not have had the materials for dissemination. And here, the digitization of the archives has become very crucial as a social media repertoire for exhibition and pedagogy. Interestingly, the archive tends to surmount the dichotomy between exhibition and pedagogy, which is something to think about in the long term, theoretically and curatorially. Third, the museums might not have been able to develop pedagogical methods to articulate programs for the public through social media. And by pedagogy, I do not only mean the distribution of guides. I am thinking of an active pedagogy, and hopefully one thriving on reciprocity involving a responsive and responsible public. At the Vargas Museum, we realized that the investment in intense pedagogy would bear fruit at that point when it became the mode through which to communicate museum presence with the help from our work from home interns, an internship well suited to the condition of the moment. So we had this museum education guide for all the levels in the educational system. We have the study guide for every exhibition. And then we also disseminated some modules from our archives. And this is we're proud of this initiative, the work from home interns who helped us develop this dissemination of the archive. So the digitized archive, mediated by the pedagogical propositions of the study guide in the form of modules, to some extent overcame the binarism between exhibition and education. And I think this is something to look into in the future, this surmounting of the dualism between exhibition and education through an interactive archive. By way of conclusion, I ask, what is there to expect as we move forward? First, while exhibitions planned before the pandemic might be staged in terms of how they had been curatorially conceived, it might be productive to reconsider the exhibition modality curatorially. For those exhibitions which have been able to gestate or percolate in pandemic time, their curatorial mediation should significantly modify. They need not revert to the pre-COVID curatorial mentality and could stake out a different ground. Digital migration seems to be the most feasible option in the near future. But as in all migrations, migrants need time to resettle, get used to the new technological milieu, take in the surroundings, and nurture ties with neighbors and possible communities for survival and well-being, and to prevail amid hostilities, both intermittent and systemic. Second, there might be a need to rethink how museum workers are skilled or how they assume administrative or managerial functions. I am thinking of one of the strengths of the Filipino cultural worker, which is to improvise and multitask and not indulge the mannerisms of specialization and invite paralysis when one specialist fails to show up. We can take this one step further, placing the instinct within a reflexive structure so that it could confront situations with a nimble and practical intelligence, a multifaceted faculty that can in basic ways curate, conserve, install, manage social media, tour, and so on, at a time when collaterals actually are the museum. Third, the museums might need to reach out more to organic social initiatives like artist-generated spaces, civil society movements with strong sympathy for cultural forms, and digital communities to form a meshwork of like-minded advocacies. And we see here the initiative of MCAD. Such meshwork is not meant to expand and extract. The logic should not be expansionist and extractive. Museums should work with interest and care and offer up space to collaborators to cohabit the museological domain. Surely this involves trust and respect and a willingness to make the time for process and deliberating with colleagues who should not be treated like mere content providers or suppliers. This cooperation or mutuality was best seen in how early this month the Vargas Museum opened an exhibition in which the artist himself supervised the installation and produced his own walkthrough. And this is Joe Tanierla, a clear case of enabling the exhibiting artist to assume the role of a museum worker. To conclude, I would like to say that Philippine museums should spend time thinking through the context of institutionality. And I'm referring not to the institution, which is fully formed or confined to its accustomed bureaucracy. I am pointing to a more unhinged process of institution making that is able to mediate critique from the social sphere and reinscribe it to transform itself from within, painstakingly but with diligence. Finally, Philippine museums should instill a more exciting curatorial imagination or a more exciting curatorial unconscious, one that seriously looks at the exhibitionary model, render it vulnerable to complications, and surface its most useful talent in presenting not objects but materialities, not iconographies, themes, or spectacles, but sensuous and sensible particularities. A repositioned curatorial imagination or unconscious should also be able to recast the museum in relation to the ecology around it in terms of varied scales and registers, in sustained relays, and not in grand events or narratives. The museum I curate is practically in a rainforest, and the donor of the collection, Jorge Vargas, once had a garden and a small farm in the compound that housed his art and other cultural materials. A museum surrounded by a garden or anything lively would animate it incipiently and perhaps incessantly. This takes us to the direction of the local, an extensive locality that moves forward by slowing down, or gathers the world by being rooted in a dense mangrove of immediacies as well as mediations. It is a local that is not only absorbed in the international and global system, it is rather an interlocutor, a co-producer, and not another circuit of over-circulated art that is supposedly worldly. I will end with Jorge Vargas, who named his family residence Kawilihan in Mandaluyong. Its root word, wili, is attentiveness, interest, penchant, fondness, liking, pleasure, enjoyment. In the early lexicon, it straddles between affection in Noceda and Sanlúcar, a profound, deep-seated affection on the one hand, and afición in San Buenaventura, a habit, inclination, talent, or an enthusiasm. These words gravitate around love. In one Filipino translation, wili is considered mataos na pagmamahal, or a lofty devotion to the beloved. If kawilihan as a concept work hovers around a particular structure of feeling or a precious belonging, then it is inevitably a cognate of the ethos of care, and by extension of curation, in the sense of a possession of being under the care or in the custody, or curiosity, the inquisitiveness about things. Because the state of kawilihan or the condition of wili is absorption, love makes sense as a discursive articulation of the world, of the word. The collector or lover loses the self who is absorbed in the collection. In the Serrano-Lactau Dictionary, the absorbed subject is aficionado, apegado, encariñado, that is generally attached and is a connoisseur. Such cultivated attachment and connoisseurship are mediated by an object of desire. The example of the lexicographer is intriguingly allegorical and potentially moral, and I quote him, "Hindi mawiwili ang aso kundi binibigyan ng buto. The dog will not be engaged if not given a bone. Wili therefore hinges the subject to the object in order to be distracted." Going back to the garden and farm of Vargas in the very same place that fostered his trove of heritage material, I would like to risk that this may well be a model for an interspecies ecology in which culture and agriculture, art and farm animals mingle in his generous vision of what is Filipiniana, or anything Philippine or Filipino. It is for this reason that I am inspired as a curator to cultivate a garden too around the museum after the pandemic has run its course, and develop a public art space at a time when the outdoors are safer than enclosed spaces. The museum after COVID or through COVID or living out or with COVID in memory and its afterlife in a highly compromised ecology and a hopefully chastened humanity will have to contend with the double bind of institutionality as signaled by the word kawilihan to propose the prospects of both absorption and distraction. The institutional imagination of the Philippine Museum should therefore reposition. It should prompt its public to be enchanted and also to disbelieve, to be punctual and to be untimely, and to be finally simultaneously viral and vernacular. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Flores, for that very interesting presentation and for raising critical questions and problems while looking at responses that reflect on assessing weaknesses and strengths in creating inspired new models in the very near future. I think our two speakers have posed challenges for all of us to reflect on. And we now come to the part where participants can get to dialogue with our speakers. And we have with us this morning Ms. Yael Buencamino, who will facilitate the Q&A segment of our session today. Ms. Buencamino is the Vice President of the Alliance of Greater Metro Manila Museums, AGMAM, and a board member of the Museum Foundation of the Philippines. She was a former director of Arete, the Art and Innovation Hub of the Ateneo de Manila University. She is currently a consultant for the Lopez Museum and Library. May I invite our two speakers, Dr. Eugene Tan and Dr. Patrick Flores, to join Ms. Buencamino for a question and answer session with our audience.
Hi, Eugene. Hi, Patrick.
Hi, Yael.
Hello, yeah.
Thank you very much for that, for those wonderful presentations. I think there was a lot of food for thought for all of us. I think one of the things that stands common among a lot of museums is that this pandemic has given us the opportunity to take a step back and rethink what we're doing, or if not rethink, maybe given us the opportunity to push forward ideas that have already been percolating, especially in the realms of engendering more critical discussions and social and engaging in different ways of engaging with our publics. We have a few questions here. Let me start with the one from Matthew Lopez. He is asking, what should be done to safely reopen our museums, given that museums are public spaces that people see as a refuge from the abnormalities of life?
So maybe I can start. So I understand that museums in Manila are still closed at this time.
Yes.
Well, in Singapore, we opened our museums in July, so we've been open for a few months now. So what we had to do was to ensure that we had social distancing measures in place, not only for the museum as a whole, but also within each of the exhibition galleries. So making sure that there are a limited number of visitors within each gallery, they're all evenly spaced out. We couldn't have any tours at the start, but now the regulations have relaxed and we are now able to have tours for up to 5 people, because the number of cases in Singapore has dropped quite substantially. So it's just having all these measures in place, constant cleaning as well of all the spaces. But it is possible, and we are seeing our visitors come back. We're now at the level of about 50% of what we were at pre-COVID levels. And prior to that, half of our visitors were from outside of Singapore anyway. So it seems it's very encouraging that all Singaporeans are starting to come back to the museum.
Yeah, the physical opening, Yael, of the museum in Manila is quite tricky because we are constrained by the guidelines of the Department of Health now. So at the moment, we can only, I think, accept a certain percentage of of our regular audience to come into the museum. So at the Vargas Museum, we regulate that through an appointment system in which we schedule the appointments of those who would like to see the physical exhibition. So this requires a lot of coordination between staff and audience, as well as the putting in place of very stringent protocols. I am, as a curator, not only wary of the transmission of of course, the virus, but also the intense bureaucracy of contact tracing. So there was a time when one of the staff members of the Vargas tested positive, and we had to close for the entire quarantine period, his quarantine period. So I want to avoid that thing to happen again. So that's why I'm, a bit paranoid uh, about these protocols. Yeah.
And how many people are you allowing into the museum? How many, like, do you have appointments for groups of people? Do they
Yeah.
come in groups or individuals?
It should be like 10 for us. It depends on the space now. So it should, for us, I thought it would be, I think 10 would be the best number. And we're also governed by the university rules now. The university is still currently closed.
Mhm.
So yeah, so we have to contend with that as well.
We have a question here from LK Ligor, which came via Facebook. How has your work routine changed during the pandemic? And how do you think the museum landscape will change in 2021, 2022? That's for both of you as well.
Do you want to go first, Patrick?
Yeah, difficult to foresee the future. I think we are standing too close to the situation, like assembling the plane in midair, no? So see, the engineering happens as we go to work every day. Nah? I think that's the best way to put it. So from now and maybe next year or in the next 2 years, the efforts will be focused on calibrations of existing systems. I think that's the best we can do. And maybe from there, innovate or take more risks in putting in place a different structure. But I think in the near future, it would be, painstaking, patient calibrations within the system. And every step should be in the right direction. Yeah.
As with the theme of your Biennale, Patrick. For us, yes, well, having to work from home, I think one of the biggest disruptions was the disruption to our planning and of the exhibition programming that we've been working on for years. As you know, some of our exhibitions take years to organize and for them to materialize. And this year we've had to cancel some exhibitions, including a very large Matisse Picasso exhibition, which unfortunately will not happen anymore. But then this also has some effect on our future years programming, where we have to kind of relook what this means for us. So focusing more on our local context as well as our regional context. I think another disruption is really having to work from home. Even though our museum is now open, we're still in split teams, which means only half the museum staff can come back to the office at any one time. But even then, that is not encouraged if you can work from home. So what this means is that all our interactions, even as a curatorial team, are all through these online platforms. And this is not as effective, I feel, when we are kind of brainstorming, developing certain projects together. And this is something I hope we can find a more effective way to do. So as well, and as with other museums, we've moved a lot of our programs, exhibitions online. But at the same time, I think while I agree with Patrick that this should be seen as a supplement to actual physical museum visits and engagements with the museum. But at the same time, it's not a replacement in that way. And you cannot replace that actual primary experience encounter with the work of art to something that's on a 5-inch or 6-inch screen. Yeah, and so that's something that also has to be considered.
Patrick, Eugene spoke a bit about the difficulty of working from home and um, meeting with your curatorial teams online. The engagement is quite different. How did you manage that with your work from home interns? Um, it's difficult enough to manage internships, but to have them working from home, um, that was quite ingenious, and I commend you on being able to harness a good workforce from that.
Yeah, yeah, because they are digital natives. Yeah, and I am a digital migrant. So it was easier for them to work within that mode. And so I built on that capacity, almost like an intrinsic capacity of this generation to harness the potentials of social media. So the um, the staff coordinated, the Vargas Museum staff coordinated with the interns, and they were given tasks weekly, and we also wanted to expose them to the various aspects of museum work. No, so for instance, this week one intern would do publicity, and then the next week he or she would do the study guide, and so on and so forth. So aside from having that benefit of an additional workforce from them, we were also implicitly trying to develop museum or curatorial resources through the through the through the intern, so that maybe at some point in their professional lives they might also want to join the museum force.
Yeah, that's a wonderful way of expanding your stakeholders in the museum.
Yeah, yeah. And also they were the ones well connected to social media. So I think they helped us develop traffic too.
Yes, we all need help with that.
Yeah.
Us digital migrants.
Yes, so slow to resettle.
We have a question here from Patrick Payumo. He's asking how does curation or curatorial practice help people understand the museum within the context of the pandemic, of this pandemic?
Yeah, no, maybe I can start. So I think one of the things that museums have the ability to do, either working with artists that are living today or artists in their collection, works in their collection, is to kind of draw from the current context and to even use works from its historical collection to frame some of the issues. And I think in some ways it's easier to do with a historical collection than it is to do this with contemporary artists, because sometimes the issues are very raw. And given the polarization in our societies today, this can become contentious and very difficult situations for museums to manage. And this is something I think museums have to be aware of as well, that the ability and the capacity to manage these kinds of difficult discussions in the museum. But similarly, drawing from a museum's historical collection with the benefit of time, I think it's an easier way to kind of highlight some of the issues of today by kind of looking at the art of the past.
Yeah, and we realized that the immediate environment of the digital audience was their homes now. So they were confined to that very intimate space. So we drew from the collection aspects of in the artworks that reference that immediate space. So we looked into, for instance, the still life or the genre pieces or even portraits now. So we tried to make this connection between what is visually articulated in our collection and what they are like experiencing in their own space. And from there begin a conversation on a range of themes like maybe what plants do you see, or what food do you cook, no? I mean, as basic as that. And to take it further at some point by asking them to uh, create forms too, like if they can sketch out a still life, or draw a portrait, or maybe photograph a scene from the window. So that kind of relay from very everyday experience to a materialization in discourse, and also a materialization in actual form. No? Mm.
I wanted picking up on that, the engagement with the public. Museums, as you both mentioned, museums. The first thing that they did was to try to take their collections online, right, and to present themselves to the public. How has the exchange been? Like, there are not the as you mentioned, you've asked people to sketch or draw or engage with your collection in more active ways. Is this something that you ask them to come back and post on your social media and on your or on your website or Twitter, Instagram, or is it more? And have you seen more interaction, more engagement from them? Like, are they willing to share what insights they've gathered or their own artworks?
Is that for me, Yael?
Yeah, for both of you actually, because you both have very active. You seem to have very active online platforms.
I think at this point the engagement is not so lively or robust as we would like it to be. I think we are in the maybe beginning, the initial phases of this migration, but there is contact now. There is already contact. There is traffic, but engagement is still slow to come. No, there might be another level to take the traffic or contact too. I don't know how to do that at this point, but yeah, we look forward to a livelier engagement in terms of the public really actively engaging with us. No? Yeah.
For us, I think we have varying levels of engagement depending on the programs. So at the National Gallery, we have very popular children's festivals and our children's Biennale. And this year we had to make it all online, and this became a series of activities as well as a game, online game. And I think what we're still learning is how do we measure engagement with these kinds of digital platforms, as well as through engagements on such as the talks that we're having now, for example. Another thing we did was to actually have tours online. I think that Patrick also spoke about, and these happen through Zoom meetings. So the guide, so to speak, could actually see all the participants of the tour. And I think that from what I observed, that was a more kind of engaging experience for those also participating in the tour. So that's something we are trying to do more of, given the absence of physical tours as well.
We have a question here from Lawrence Charles Salazar. It appears that museums readily jump to the digital bandwagon, whether prepared or unprepared. As we slowly relax stringent measures on mobility in the Philippines, how do we encourage museums to migrate to mounting outdoor exhibitions, which is more feasible now that indoor exhibitions and indoor exhibitions and engaging online? And in turn, how do we give confidence to the public that going to museums is safe and remains an essential activity? Patrick, I think you touched a little bit on the outdoor.
Yeah. I'd like to further explore the potential of the Vargas outdoors, not only in terms of cultivating a garden around the museum inspired by the donor himself, Jorge Vargas, who had one um, in his old compound. No? I don't think we can have chickens or or but we used to have a dog. But anyway, we can develop the lawn, for instance, the front lawn of the Vargas as a possible space for public art, and we've been doing that actually. The start of the pandemic, we had a show of Junyi talking about quarantine, no? And adjacent to that, there is a bit of a de facto sculpture garden, which has sculptures from the UP collection. So it might, I mean, the university could be persuaded to develop that piece of land into like a sculpture garden that will, in a way, bridge the spaces between, let us say, the College of Fine Arts and the Vargas Museum. So because they are, in a way, divided by that, I mean, split by, separated by that piece of land. So yeah, so we're trying to develop that. And also, maybe as to your second question about how to convince them that it's safe to return to the museums, well, we can, of course, put in place protocols, no? And I think ensure ventilation. This is I think, a key, no? If the maybe the normalization or the return to the museum space, the ventilation. And I say that because Vargas, the architecture of the Vargas was conceptualized as some kind of a tropical architecture. So it makes me think about that too. Of course, that has changed over time because of the requirements of conservation. So we had to air condition some parts, no? Of the Vargas, but it was originally premised on passive cooling, which was some kind of advocacy of the architect for tropical architecture. I'd like to rethink that now, moving forward.
Well, in Singapore, I think the outdoors is something that's very underrated and overlooked in most Singaporeans' mindsets. I think the sociologists Chua Beng-Huat once famously wrote this book about Singapore called The Air-Conditioned Nation, where we all like to be inside air-conditioned spaces. I think given that this pandemic has also restricted travel, and given the small size of Singapore, we have to really explore our outdoor spaces as much as possible. This is something our tourism board is also trying to get us to do, to be more aware of our local tourist sites, especially the outdoor ones. And I agree. I think this is something we also have to explore as a site and location for art. And this is in fact something the Singapore Art Museum is looking at. But while it happened during this time of pandemic, it's also part of our strategy to really look at art in the public space, public sphere, thinking beyond the physical confines of the museum space, but to have art in the everyday spaces, including outdoor spaces as well. And to the second question, I think, looking at all the protocols that museums need to have. I don't know, is wearing a mask mandatory in the Philippines?
Yeah.
But they take all these measures, hand sanitizers. I think at CMAM a few months ago, we published some guidelines that museums can consider when they during this period. You know, it probably needs to be updated, but those are some of the things that will give confidence to the public in ensuring that museums continue to be safe places.
We have several questions here about online activities as supplements to education. From Jay Pasena, he asks, now that online engagements are more active for the target audience of museums, I'm curious about what models or programs for the younger audience are being thought of, like for children from like 7 to 16-year-old, considering the disadvantage of being exposed to too much online activities? What strategies can be implemented to engage with the children or with the parents? Is this a consideration in your institution? That's for both of you.
Yeah, as I mentioned, we have two kind of signature children's programs, Children's Festival and a Children's Biennale, and we're kind of moving them to become these online engagements. But also our education team has been rolling out programs precisely for parents to kind of engage with their children, learning from whatever museums are doing around the world as well. And these goes range from kind of craft making workshops to all sorts of activities, and they've been quite popular, and the uptake has been quite encouraging. But also because schools have also stopped coming to the museums because all excursions have been cancelled. We're also thinking of ways to kind of reach out to school children now that schools are open again, and for us to actually, we've been working with us as teachers of schools to somehow replicate the lessons that they would otherwise have had here back in their own classroom through tours and other kinds of activities. But how we can also have a physical presence in some of these schools through a touring program, for example.
I think in Manila, the Ayala Museum seems to be at the forefront of this initiative of really addressing the needs of children and also their parents. No? So one way to do this is to look into the curricula, the curricula of the educational system, and find a space for art to inhabit that that curriculum system. And since many of the kids, and I think all of the kids are on distance learning, and practically it's a homeschool environment, no? And the parents are very much partners in this. So if we can provide parents some alternative educational materials through art, but within the curriculum, then it might be able to support their ways of homeschooling. And Ayala also, I was talking to Mariles, and she was telling me that they classified the library, the Filipinas Heritage Library, and then the Ayala Library, for possible resources for the parent. Yeah. So that's something to it's very interesting for me, that to classify the library for the use of children and parents. Yeah. So I think that the curriculum could be an entry point to this intersection between the home and then the museum, through this educational system, because it is already part of a routine. So we should be, art should insert itself in the routine through the curriculum.
And I do think parents are very appreciative of these efforts from museums to help them enliven their children's educations, and also like the activities of the Singapore of the NGS that encourages the parents to do crafts with their children, because you do want to get them away from the screen, considering a lot of museums are doing a lot of online classes. From Mitzi Marie Aguilar, the Dean of the UP College of Fine Arts, she's asking, in the time of pandemic, especially when schools are doing online and remote learning and school students cannot visit museums, this is just, I think, a reiteration of one of the questions that was already asked. What are your plans and activities in order to reach out and to share with them the many things you can learn from museums so that they can continue to appreciate art. I think that you've addressed this question. Another one is from Lisa Lucero. Um, I would like to affirm the museums in their efforts to provide educational materials, study guides that can be used for online learning. What other ways could you suggest to educators that they integrate these into their online teaching? I ask because there is that frustration of being unable to safely allow our students to experience the works in actuality given the limitations of the pandemic. Is there anything you'd like to add to those two questions?
Yes, I think something that educators should make use of is, I think since the pandemic and the lockdowns, as you mentioned, a lot of museums have started putting their collections online, but not in a way that they've done before. I think they've really thought about how to make it more user-friendly and accessible. So that it's now much more conducive, I think, to go to a museum's website and to see their virtual exhibitions. Um, Many museums have also started presenting virtual exhibitions in themselves, exhibitions created just for the virtual space. I think these are really good opportunities to allow educators and their students to visit exhibitions and museums all around the world from their classroom or an online classroom even.
Yeah. Well, what I can add is perhaps to that educators can focus more on the image. On the image, of course, there's now, I mean, nothing compares with the physical encounter now. But I think the times do not call for comparisons. No? But some kind of like an understanding, a new understanding of the image, because it is the image that circulates through social media, and it is also image that saturates current society. So a re-engagement perhaps with the image, a study of the image, how it works, if what is information, what is the information that the image produces, how is that information produced in the algorithm of the digital world. So I think modules on the image, because the image is this, the, the internet is the almost the natural habitat of the image. It's not, I mean, the image is not just a substitute, no, of the physical form in the internet. It is the form. No? So if we can educate or create more discussion around this concept of what is an image, no? In a like a neoliberal society of the spectacle, then I think we can contribute to the understanding of society itself through an understanding of the image.
From Lisa Lorenzo for Eugene Tan. Hello, Eugene. How have your visitor numbers on site and online fared during this pandemic? Do you see an uptick online? And what are the most popular online visits for?
Hi, Isa. Nice to see you. As yes, I mentioned previously, we're in terms of our in terms of our physical visitor numbers, we're at 50% of what we were at the pre-lockdown period. And even then, I think in the pre-lockdown period, 50% of our visitors were from outside of Singapore. So it seems like all the Singaporeans who usually come to the museums are coming back. And this is because we've also had some new exhibitions, such as the 2 exhibitions that were open as part of the initiative Proposals for Novel Ways of Being. As for our online visitorship, I don't have those figures on me, but our most popular ones are the children's programs, I must say. But for the talks and such as these and discussions, we have between 100 to 200 people attending each time. So it's quite consistent, I think.
That's interesting that you have the same number of Singaporeans coming back, considering you don't have school groups coming back. So they're probably coming in more as individuals now than you used to have them.
Yes, I think this is also because Singaporeans are so used to traveling even for weekends previously to countries in the region, but now they can't go anywhere, so they have to kind of look for places to go in Singapore. And I think the museum, well, I'm glad they're coming to the museum.
Um, we have a question here about funding from Raymond Del Rosario. How do museums seek and sustain financial resources during these times? This is for both of you. And I'd also like just to complicate it a bit further. I was wondering, both of you spoke about, or more especially Jean, spoke about appreciating the neoliberal structures that we live within, and beginning to acknowledge the the structures that allow our museums to be, what funds us, and how do you deal with that, acknowledging these structures while maintaining criticality, and in these times of great necessity for fundraising.
Yeah. Of course, that is assuming we have financial resources, no?
Yes.
To sustain. Anyway, I can speak only for Vargas. The Vargas is attached to the university, and the funding comes from the university. So the museum is not a priority of the university. So aside from the maintenance of the infrastructure and the salaries of the personnel, the university doesn't fund the programs of the museum. So we really have to partner with structures or communities or formations outside of the university structure. So this is a delicate balancing act. No? How does one maintain independence or maintain independence as the museum relates to an outside world with competing interests? So one way to do it is really to enhance the immune system of the university museum, that it can actually confront or be open, be vulnerable to outside forces, but at the same time mediate it decisively, mediate those forces decisively with the best interests of the institution in mind. So I'm not afraid of working with various forces outside, independent artists, private galleries, institutions. No, for me, working with them only enhances the immune system of the university museum. It becomes it belongs to the social world in a truer way, no? Not something confined to like the ivory tower or the campus of the UP. So for me, it's like that. It's case to case. There's no formula in terms of getting funding. No template to sustain these resources. Aside from the fact that we're open to working with the various forces in the ecology.
Yes, for us, as with most museums around the world, because of the lockdowns and the drop in visitorship, our revenue and income was severely impacted. Unfortunately, we receive a large part of our funding from the ministry and from the government. And we're lucky in the sense that they see the museum and art as an important public good. But of course, I think governments all around the world have had to expand a huge amount of resources to support their economies. And Singapore is no different. I think the government invested about 100 billion Singapore dollars just to prop up the economy and support the workers during this time. So I think this will have an impact on our budgets in years to come. And of course, fundraising during this time when all companies are also severely infected have also affected our fundraising abilities, right? But I think going back to also your question about recognizing the kind of neoliberal societies in which we operate and what this means for museums. Yeah, while it's very good that state museums get public funding, as you mentioned, this also leads to the risk of instrumentalization and the loss of autonomy. At the same time, we see museums in the States who are almost, I would say, solely reliant on private patronage, being subservient then to conflicts of interest with their board members and their patrons and donors. So it's a very difficult situation, I think, for museums to navigate. But I think understanding these conflicts of interest, understanding that the museum and who the stakeholders that fund it, their ethical interests, being diverse and inclusive in everything that the museum does, being aware of this in terms of how we seek out funding is also, I think, important considerations, in addition to just kind of operating as a museum, I think.
Yeah, and Yael, I think to add a little bit, no, I think this budget, this logistical constraint or issue should not be seen as separate from curatorial work. The curator, the director of the museum should reinscribe this constraint into the production of a specific curatorial form. So a particular logistical landscape creates the conditions for a different curatorial form to emerge. So I think that is the contribution of any museum, no? That it doesn't repeat or re-articulate a model or paradigm elsewhere, but to produce its own through its own engagement with the ecology.
And to extend what Patrick is saying, I think this needs to also extend to how we think of the governance and structures of museums themselves. You know, what this idea of the curatorial and the changes that curatorial needs to be to also affect how museums are structured and how we operate.
Thank you. We have a question here from Alec of the Met Museum. Given our public interactions are mostly online now, do you observe a rise in new media, digital media, or time-based artworks, or even exhibits built specifically for virtual spaces? Do you feel like artists are now creating more digital works, or more artists are interested in creating digital works who weren't before, due to the fact that a lot of the engagement is now online?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think not at this point, not yet. No, what migrates more easily is moving image.
Mm-hmm.
So the entry point might be video and independent cinema into new media. Yeah, but I don't see a critical mass yet of production from that area.
Yes, no, I agree with Patrick. I think what artists have been doing is presenting what they've been doing online, but not necessarily using the medium as a way to generate new ideas and new works. But I think at the same time, there's a lot of potential. Because when you think of it now, what we call digital artworks or digital experiences, involving, for example, AR and VR, which you would go into a museum to experience by putting on a headset or something. This is something you could do in the comfort of your own home, if you think about it. All you need is a VR headset, which are now very commonplace. So I think this is also a way that artists can reach out and present works in new and different ways, instead of thinking that certain types of experiences and exhibitions can only be presented and experienced in a museum or an art space, for example.
Elizabeth Ong asks, are you aware of a similar precedence that threaten museums that we can draw inspiration from and hope from to realize that museums can outlive this crisis and recover?
Well, as you know, this pandemic, while it's one of the most serious in over 100 years, it's not the first time we've had this kind of pandemic, and not the first time we've had crises such as this as well. And I think I'm confident that all what we're doing now to think about our futures, what we need to do, keep knowing that this is going to be around for at least a few years, even if not even longer, and that somehow we'll get through this, given our spirit and our vitality, to kind of overcome these difficulties. But I can't think of any specific historical precedent for something like this. You, Patrick?
Yeah, maybe I have not lived that long to, to, yeah, to offer an example. But in terms of like paradigm or a best practice kind of thing in the Philippines to address this roadmap, a possible roadmap out of the pandemic or living with the pandemic as we slowly open the museum. One might look into the work at Pinto Museum, which is the most visited in the country, I think. It is outside Manila, and it has a good collection of art from the 80s to the present. No? So, but it is also housed in a some kind of a like a series of villas, no, or pavilions, no, and then between those pavilions are gardens and some structures, no. So I think that's a good model to begin. To begin with this integrated, context of museum, garden, and outdoors, no? I think recently they had like a tree planting a program, no? So this might be the owner, Dr. Kwanang, is a neurologist and would like to combine art and science in the larger context of well-being. So that might be something to look into. That model. Why is it so popular and also so different from the white cube?
We have a question here from Daryl Abarca that relates to something that Eugene touched on, the definition of museums. He asks, in the recent ICOM Kyoto conference last September 2019, there was a debate regarding a new museum definition. In your opinion, should museum definition be anchored in a vision containing undertones like democratizing, inclusive, human dignity and social justice, global equality and planetary well-being? Or should it remain operational by definition?
Yes, that's a very good question. Whether museums, well, I suppose museums need to be able to exist and operate before they can start doing all these things that the new definition is stating. But I guess it's also about making sure that when we are able to operate, we should be clear about what our vision for museums are. And the kinds of values that we are advocating through the kinds of work that we do, the exhibitions that we do, and how we can actually can contribute to the change that we can make into our society through expressions. And given that, artists will always respond to the issues of our day, particularly contemporary artists. And museums and curators should be conscious of presenting these in a way that helps to contribute to some of these, contribute towards moving some of these issues forward, I would say. Yeah. But Patrick, were you at the conference last year in Kyoto?
I heard about it, and it was for me very exciting, just to revisit the definition. I think that's the scene of the crime.
No, but as I shared, there was a lot of controversy, and because ICOM is not made up just of art museums, but of all kinds of museums and from all over the world. So it seems not everyone agrees with this definition yet.
But the inclination to revisit the definition, I think, is one important step forward. Just to not to take it for granted. So I mean, this idea of the new normal should actually help us, should prompt us to think about the normal. Mm-hmm. So I think this is, in relation to the museum. So we have to go back to certain assumptions about what it is. What do we mean when we say normal, or what do we mean when we say museum? So, and the way to answer this is through practice. Not really to, maybe, of course, to offer another, maybe more hospitable definition, but more profoundly through practice, how you do it in your own spaces, that will produce the definition. It's not that you define something and then the practice exemplifies. The practice should create the conditions of a definition.
Yes, no, I agree. I think this is a time for us to all reflect on what we are as institutions, our roles and missions. And I've been reflecting in recent times about this idea of the constituent museum, which is a concept kind of brought up or developed by LA International, a consortium of some European museums. And how this is really about putting relationships at the center of what museums do. Our relationships with what we previously call our stakeholders, I suppose our publics, our funders, our artists, but thinking of them as constituents, which is also a political term, right? And giving agency, and how they themselves also embody a certain sense of agency. But how these relationships will have to force us to also change the way we operate, the way we govern ourselves, the way we work, in order to achieve this idea as well. Yeah.
I agree with both of you, and I feel like in your museums, despite regardless of what the definition is, your exhibitions have exemplified these values or these themes. And I think a lot of museums, like as you said, Patrick, the museum has been going towards a more interdisciplinary experience of the museum. And I have to say that I think after being cooped up in our homes for so long, people are looking forward to seeing not just what's inside the museum, but what the outdoor spaces can offer. So opportunities for seeing public art outside, or even experiencing the gardens and being able to appreciate this as part of Filipiniana, or as part of cultural knowledge, would be very welcome for people who are not the same people that we kind of left at the start of the pandemic. Everyone has now different needs and different desires, and I think museums are trying to meet those newly realized, perhaps, needs of people. Well, we don't have many more questions from the audience, so that gives me an opportunity to ask you more questions that I was interested in. Eugene, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about your interactions with the different museums and art spaces and artists for that exhibition, Novel Ways of Being, and how quickly you came up with that idea when the pandemic started.
Yeah, so it started around April, just as the lockdown in Singapore was happening. And we, by that time, I was aware that this was going to have a big impact on the artists, independent art workers, curators. As you know, a lot of artists also, we engage a lot of them for our programs, not just for exhibitions, to do tours and programs with our children, our visitors as well. And all this was going to stop, of course. So we had to think of new ways to support them. So this was what we came up with. We reached out to 10 other institutions as well as artist-run spaces, independent spaces, to try and support these workers, cultural workers. So each of us appointed an independent curator who worked with up to around 10 artists. So in total, about 170 artists were kind of supported during this project. All of them were paid a fee for their participation in these projects and presented to the public in this way, both physical as well as online. This was the quickest thing we could think of to try and help artists and support this ecology during this time. So, and it opened in August. The first projects opened in August, and they'll start launching until February next year.
Yeah. Patrick, I was wondering if you knew of any initiatives that might be similar in the Philippines, or maybe I could ask, in your experience, if Vargas Museum or any of the museums you know of have tried to support artists in this period, or independent curators, because they're the ones that are quite affected by this.
I think I'm not so sure about the support of the museums to artists, but I noticed that the artists are supporting themselves. No? And this is a very inspiring situation in which the artist as a citizen, the artist as a political subject finds it in his or her practice to also create conditions of well-being among his or her peers. No? So they help each other. So, and I think the pandemic also made the artists realize that they cannot be exclusively, or they cannot be forever dependent on institutions. And I think that the pandemic should also made them realize how to self-manage or how to self-govern. Eugene was talking about governance as a transformable structure, right? Or as transformable procedure. I think so is it with the governance of one's career or one's practice or one's relationships with the market or with institutions. The artist should also develop a tougher, denser immune system to be able to, to withstand the whatever interests that may come his or her way. No? So yeah, self-management, self-governance, relative autonomy, I think should be it makes the artist more strongly positioned to move in different directions at any given time. No? So there is no like paralysis. Also, there is no belabored anxiety. No? It's all this like quick intelligence to be able to respond to whatever emergency.
Yes. I like your use of the immune system as an analogy for the way artists and museums react to the situations. Do you have questions that you'd like to ask each other?
Uh, so Eugene, maybe I have one for Eugene. Uh, because Singapore Art Museum also does the Biennale, no? So there will be another one soon, no? In terms of the schedule, no? Supposedly, supposedly. How do you envision a post-COVID Biennale?
Well, that's a very good question, and that's thinking about both. What does it mean to have a Biennale on a kind of large scale
Mm-hmm.
over every 2 years? And given this disruption, does that still have to be every 2 years, right? So because you did the last one, which opened in 2019, so the next one should be in 21, which is next year, which is we've seen biennales being disrupted all around the world. I think a lot of them have postponed their start dates. Gwangju, even Venice, delayed it for a year. Right? But beyond the timing of it, it's also
19 in November.
Yes, yours was in November last year. Yeah. But beyond the timing, it's also about what form the Biennale should take, right? Also, given what we're talking about, these outdoor spaces and SAM's mission to also kind of infuse art into the everyday, for example, and not being confined to just museum spaces or art spaces. So these are all ways we're thinking about how all the different forms of Biennale can take. So yeah, so watch this space for the next edition.
Yeah. That's great to hear, Eugene. I tried to disperse the last Biennale also into various spaces, and I found it challenging to do in Singapore, and that's why I'm so I was so interested in how you did the network of the novel ways. It's I think a good step in creating that more interactive ecology between spaces in Singapore.
And this also goes back to what I was talking about, the constituent museum, and also recognizing that all these other independent art spaces are also part of our constituents, right? And it's we need to also work with them. I don't think there should be this separation of the museum and other types of art spaces within the ecology. We all have to work together and not try to differentiate ourselves, but all work towards a common objective, I suppose, right? Yeah, I think it was, well, I joined SAM while the planning and preparation for your Biennale was well underway, right? And so it was already quite fixed, and yeah, but let's see for the future ones how we can continue to diffuse. But you had some successes with some of the partners that you worked with for the Biennale as well, right?
Yeah, I was so happy with the results of those collaborations because they also found it important to be part of the Biennale, and that they were very curatorially engaged. That we didn't only subcontract content; they produced content as well.
Yeah, but it was kind of co-produced with them.
Yeah, I think that is a key term, no, co-production, rather than just assimilating them into this like monolith structure, which is the museum.
And yeah, I think this is one of the often overlooked successes of what a Biennale means, this idea of co-production with multiple partners. The emphasis is always on that kind of big visual exhibition, which goes very much to what Yael was talking about, this idea of the spectacle and the fact that we're living in this neoliberal societies that privilege these spectacles, right? But I think we do need to think of how biennales have the possibilities to break away from these structures and to create more meaningful relationships and results, I think.
On that note, I think we're about out of time. I'd like to thank you both, Eugene and Patrick, for your wonderful presentations and that very rich discussion. I feel like we had a very engaged audience that uh, took a lot away from your presentations. Um, I you've introduced a lot of new concepts, such as the Constituent Museum, that we can chew on some more later on. And that, Patrick, I particularly like your idea of the museum as sustained relays rather than these grand big events. I think it makes it more manageable for all of us to think that we just need to keep going. We don't need to stop and plan the next big event, but just keep going um, and seeing how we evolve out of this. Thank you both very much.
Thank you, Yael.
Thank you, Yael, for moderating.
Yes. Well, I hope to see both of you in person soon. Nice as it was seeing you online.
I hope so too.
The time will come.
Thank you very much to both of you. I think I pass you back on to Tina to say good to close.
We thank our speakers today and our moderator for conducting a most relevant exchange for this morning session. We have an exciting lineup of speakers for the rest of the week. So we hope to see you again in the next 3 days. A summit e-booklet with the roster of keynote speakers, panelists, and moderators will be sent to your registered email addresses. It will also be available for download through the Manila Museums Summit 2020 Facebook event page. We would like to invite you again to our next session tomorrow at 9 a.m. as we open day 2 of the Manila Museums Summit with the theme Facing an Inevitable Change, featuring keynote speaker Suhanya Rafael of the M Plus Museum in Hong Kong and panelist Zoe Butt from the Factory Contemporary Arts Center in Ho Chi Minh, Vietnam, and Gritty Agawi Wong of the Jim Thompson Arts Center in Bangkok, Thailand. Tomorrow's session will be moderated by Ms. Mariles Costillo of the Ayala Museum. Zoom participants will receive the webinar link for day 2 right after this session. Just a reminder, please accomplish the survey form which will appear after you close the webinar on Zoom. For more information and updates, please follow the Summit event page on Facebook. Thank you all once again for joining us today. This has been day 1 of A Call to Transform Manila Museums Summit 2020, and we hope to see you all tomorrow.